Have you ever asked your audience a question only to discover that the responses didn't really move your presentation forward in the way you had hoped? Have you ever asked your audience a question and gotten no responses at all? Audience interaction is a critical aspect of any successful presentation. Getting your audience's input and participation keeps them engaged, and it creates a rich learning environment for everyone in the room. Unfortunately, the scenarios mentioned earlier are all too common when asking questions of audiences, and they keep the audience from being fully engaged. When you improve your question asking strategies, you're more likely to get the answers you want to help you illustrate the points that you're trying to make. I'm going to give you 3 tips today for how to manage this very important aspect of audience interaction. Tip number 1 is be specific. Sometimes we don't get the answers we want from the audience because they don't actually know what we want from them. I know a speaker whose topic is epilepsy, and when she begins her presentations, she wants to get an idea of what the audience already knows about epilepsy and seizures. But what she really wants to know is what sort of myths and beliefs have they heard about epilepsy and seizures? Things like frothing at the mouth, or having to put a book between somebody's teeth, or the possibility of someone swallowing their tongue. And she wants to get this information from the audience so that she can then dispel these myths about epilepsy. Now, to get the kinds of answers she wants, she has to ask a very specific question, and she'll ask something like this. What are some common beliefs you've heard about epilepsy and seizures? This way the audience can share any anecdotal stories or anything they've heard, but they don't have to share their own personal beliefs or their own personal understanding about epilepsy, which might be a little bit uncomfortable or even embarrassing for them. Tip number 2 is ask a series of questions when one isn't enough. Sometimes we want to lead our audience down a path to the final answer that we want, and in order to do this, we build on our questions with clear words and concepts. Now, I know another speaker whose topic is nutrition, and she wants her audience to understand the connection between what they consume and their fertility. And she's going to use the queen bee as her example, because the main difference between the queen bee and the other bees is their nutritional intake. Now, she's going to put up a picture of a bunch of bees, and she's going to ask a series of questions of the audience. The first question will be, where's the queen bee in this picture? And the audience will most likely say, she's in the middle. And then the speaker will say, well, how do you know that's the queen bee? And the audience will say, well, she's bigger than all the other bees. And now the third question is the key. This is the one that's going to lead the audience directly to the point that she's trying to make. The third question will be, why do you suppose the queen bee is bigger than all the other bees? And the audience will most likely say, because she eats royal jelly. Now, of course, we're assuming that the audience is going to know a thing or two about bees, but I think that's a reasonable assumption in a room full of adults. In this case, stringing a series of questions together that draw upon common concepts that are familiar to the audience will help lead them to the answer that you want to get. Tip number 3 is, don't ask a rhetorical question unless you don't want an answer. Now, a rhetorical question is a statement that's phrased as a question in order to make a point, but not really to get a response. One that you might have heard before is by H.L. Mencken, and he says, marriage is a wonderful institution, but who would want to live in an institution? Sometimes a speaker asks a question and doesn't get a response and doesn't understand why, but usually it's because of the way the question has been phrased. So here's an example for you. A speaker might say, don't we all wish we could make more money with less work? Well, your audience will probably nod their heads and they'll smile, but you haven't actually asked them a question that requires an answer. So instead, you might want to try this. Raise your hand if you would like to make more money with less work. Now you've gotten an active response. You've gotten a show of hands. And now you can go on and ask more in-depth questions and get more audience participation and more sharing. Allowing your audience to share their lifetime of knowledge and experience benefits both the speaker and the audience. The audience members learn from each other, and the speaker learns from the audience. Also, the audience feels like their contributions are valued and not like there's some empty vessel into which the speaker is pouring all of her vast wisdom. So remember, when you're asking questions of your audience, these 3 tips. Be specific, use a series of questions if one isn't enough, and only ask a rhetorical question if you're trying to make a specific point. Practice these audience interaction strategies and you will find your audiences much more engaged, much more involved, and your presentations much more successful.